Now, before we get to actually putting any content on the page, which in the first tutorial seems to take a while, we go an hour and we don't even have anything on the page yet. But we're going to talk about a couple more aspects of navigation, and that's going to be what we're seeing here and what these lines all mean, and we're going to talk about the windows that we can pull up, the panels with our tools and our more navigation tools. So what we're seeing here, of course, is our document. This was a single page document. It's 8.5 by 11 or letter sized, and the white represents the paper. In fact, in InDesign, the term paper is used to represent white. And the reason for that is because when we go to print, anything that is white is typically paper colored. If you made some white text on over top of an image in Illustrator, that would do what's called a knock through to the page itself, unless we specified a fifth color and it was actually a lighter white ink that was put down as possibly a Pantone. That's very rare, and we'll talk about those kinds of details much further down the road. So in this case, when you see paper in your swatches, for example, that is referring to, that's white. That's referring to the color white. So this is our paper. And then the pink that we're seeing here, the pink guide or line, is our margin. That was our 1/2 inch margin that we set when we started our document. The red line on the outside of our page that is 1/8 of an inch away from the page is our bleed guide. And that is what, if we want something to bleed, we want something to print to the page edge, we take it to the bleed guide. So for example, if I wanted a header on this page, I wouldn't draw it just from the corner and to the edge of the page. I would draw it from the bleed guide down across to the other bleed guide. And I'll just color this blue for a moment. Now that would mean that I want this to bleed. And a way that I can see what it's going to look like without the bleed, and this is another navigation aspect, is by simply pressing the key W. And what that's going to do is put me into presentation mode, and I can see what the document's going to look like without all of the guides, without all the frames around my edges or my objects, and of course with the bleed trimmed away. Now, an example of what might happen if bleed wasn't done correctly. If I didn't bleed and this went to print and I had everything right to the page edge, but the trim process, when something is trimmed after being printed, we can sometimes, if we don't bleed, we can get a white edge. And I mimicked it here by coming in a little bit away from the page edge. But when you go to print, the page can move. It moves through the trim process, the paper moves and can be a missed cut. That's why we're basically, when we're bleeding, we're putting more than we need to compensate for any movement between the trim, the paper, and the blades doing it, and so on. So that's what that bleed guide is all about. That's where we bleed to. And we'll again talk more about that in class. Now, the W, I'll explain through that an aspect of always defaulting back to your main cursor. I've seen very often where people work in this mode. So I just drew a text frame, and if I had something on here, I might want to move something, but I keep trying to move something. Of course, I don't have anything here that I'm trying to move at the moment, but what I'm doing is inadvertently trying to do something while I have the text tool held. And what that's doing, I don't see it once I finally get to my selection tool. I don't see those, but if I go out of W, I've created a bunch of text frames that may not be visible otherwise. So that shows a couple things. It's an example of how easy it is to accidentally draw something or leave something on the page, or even move something accidentally. I'm just going to clean these. But it also shows us that we should always be working in this mode. And this is what I refer to as working mode. When we can see our guides, we can see the frames around our objects, we can see the page edge and so on. And then if you just want to see how it looks, that's when you go to the presentation mode. So working in this mode it can be very easy to do, in the sense that you go to presentation mode and you're really into your work, and you just decide, I want to move something, and continue working, and you find you may go a half hour and you're still working in presentation mode. But you may be missing a lot of what's going on in the overall technical aspects of the document. So it's it can be a little dangerous in terms of what you may be missing. So you always want to work in this working mode where you can see everything. And the other thing is, I have no windows up here, but there are some specific windows that typically we'll want to have up. Now this is only a single page document, but the most important panel in InDesign is the Pages panel. So I'm going to go up to Window here, and this is where you'll be able to find really any panels that you want to find. All of the windows that can be opened you'll find in here, and even the type ones. But you'll also be able to find several in the type as well. So there's the ability to find what you need, especially with type, in these two places. And type is InDesign's strength. Type is what InDesign is really all about in terms of layout, and where it's most advanced and most useful. So it gives us the opportunity to find our panels for that in a couple of places. But of course, in Windows, we can find them. And you may even see there are a couple that although this is type and tables, you have to go up to styles for your character styles, paragraph styles, and so on, where in type, they're a little more evident up here. So either way, if you are looking for a specific window, the window menu first, then the type menu may give you more direct access to some. We're going to open the Pages palette. And I call it panel, I call it palette, I call it window. I sort of use them universally. However, the Pages panel is when we are working in what's called long docs, such as a book or a magazine. It really becomes another aspect of our navigation. Now I'm just going to add a bunch of pages here. You don't have to do this, but the reason I'm doing that is so that you can see if I have a document that's populated with content here, I can double click on page 5, and that's actually what I've jumped to. I've jumped to page 5. And this just becomes very quick. We can of course scroll. If I do my space, click and drag, I can scroll through the document, but it's much easier to just jump to a page.